Hey and welcome to Neverwinter with Aragon. So I recently made a video on all of the buffing artifacts, the artifacts that will increase your party's damage overall, and you'll essentially cast these artifacts every minute together and obtain big burst damage. And you'll see that here in Crown of Keldagon, you obtain massive amounts of damage just during this short phase of your artifact call. Now what you want along with that is mounts that will also buff up your party's damage. Unfortunately, there's not a whole lot of them. Indeed, there are only 10 different ones that will buff your entire party's damage. There are some out there that yes will buff like only your damage, or some that will even buff your damage along with other buffs that will increase your party's survivability and also increasing your party's damage. They can be pretty good, like the bat swarm. However, I'm going to go over the particular mounts, and generally you will use these within a single target boss fight, not necessarily during an AoE fight. And I'm just going to go over this. This is generally what you would use for trials or dungeon boss fights. And as a DPS character, you're generally going to be using something like Tunnel Vision or your Giant Toad Tongue Lash or your Golden Touch with that 3000 magnitude during this artifact call to obtain that massive amount of damage upon that hit. You don't really want to sacrifice this 3000 magnitude because that's more than a hard hitting daily power for just like a 15% buff from like the Bat Swarm. And so these mount combat powers will generally be used by your tanks and healers, and I would recommend it. The quicker the fight goes by, the quicker you'll be out there and getting your chest and moving on to potentially doing the next run. So let's quickly go over these different mounts, what benefits they can give you, and in the end I will rank each of them in terms of the best ones you should have in your party. First up we have the Bat Swarm, and it has the benefit of increasing your own damage, but most importantly it will increase the incoming damage to the target by 15%. Then you have your Eclipse Lion, which has the same ability. Take note, all of these only last about 10 seconds, which is the same as most artifacts. And then we have the T-Rexes. Now keep in mind, all of them have a very similar power. This Tyrannosaurus Rexum, the mythic one, is mythic, the King of Spines, and increases the incoming damage to the target by 15%. And it's the same with the Commander T-Rex. And again, it's the same with the War Painted T-Rex. Now, unfortunately, all of these won't stack on top of each other. So you can't have one person using this T-Rex, the other one this one, and the other one this one. You only want to have one of those in your party. And then there's the Pegasus. You have this and you have the legendary version, and it has Magnificent Inspiration or Grand Inspiration. They do exactly the same, and there's rumors going around they stack, and I believe they do. I have tested it, but that aside, generally they're not intended to stack with one another. For example, 2 Swarms won't work, 2 Eclipse Lions won't stack, 2 T-Rexes won't stack, and all of these are considered T-Rexes, so they don't stack with each other either. And then we have like your Cauldron. You have your Hag's Cauldron, and I believe you have your other version of the Cauldron as well, the legendary version, and give you like Cauldron Fumes or Gases, and essentially buffs up your accuracy and your combat advantage for that 15%. Then there's like the Swift Golden Lion with the Oriole Armament. Essentially, you'll give everybody a shield, and when this shield expires after 10 seconds, as long as it doesn't expire by taking damage, then you will gain these stacks of Radiant Weapon. And then there is the Salamander, which there's the Rhymefire one, and I believe there's the Frost one as well, and they give the Retribution. Now all this will really do, sadly, is reduce your target's deflect by 15%. As a result, increase the party's damage if their accuracy again is not capped. And lastly, we have the Balloons mount. It's the Reconnaissance Balloons, and essentially it says in the tooltip that you will gain a 7.5% extra damage boost upon the targets within its area. Now I've went and tested every single one of those mount combat powers against the Chultan dummy. Essentially what I did was activate my combat tracker just here, go and target my dummy, and we see what our base damage hits are. We'll see that proc here, Gwen mounts, Oath Strike. You see we're getting 3086, and then we can have a look at our stats. We can use then our document to essentially stick in all of those values and see what kind of damage output we should be obtaining, and then we can simply go and let's say, cast our mount power and then check out the damage. Again, this Oriole armament from the line, you'll want to cast like 10 seconds before the artifact call, since you only gain the damage once this shield disappears, like so, giving us those 3 radiant weapon stacks. And when we go and attack our target, you can see we're gaining those radiant weapon damages here. Unfortunately, it's only 6% of the damage you deal, and then that 6% is actually reduced down by the enemy's defense. And so overall, we've tested out every single one of those mounts. Again, you can see the cauldron here will depend on what stats you have, and we're going to take it, let's say you're at 75% accuracy and the cauldron then buffs you to 90%. How much damage would you gain? About 7%. We can see the swarm does add a personal damage buff, so you've had to account for that, along with a debuff of 15%, which will contribute to your party's damage overall. And then the T-Rex is a debuff as well of 15%, so is the Eclipse Lion. And then with our Pegasus here, it's a little bit more complex. Essentially, it will add a 15% buff to your existing buffs. It won't give a debuff, but it will also add Forte. And if you can make use of that Forte, you can get like up to a nearly 18% damage buff from the Pegasus. However, as soon as you have no Forte buff, this buff becomes less depending on what buffs you have already. Like a general build will have like 60% damage buffs that can go all the way up to 100%, and then this difference, the extra damage you get from the Pegasus, can go as low as like 7.5% since it adds to your personal buffs. We tested the balloons mount, and shockingly it gives no damage buff whatsoever. The Salamander, with reducing enemies deflect chance, you can see is only about 2.73% buff. This again will depend on your accuracy, and that's judging it to be about 70% there. And then you can see the King of Spines 15% and War Painted T-Rex also 15%. And so we end up with this chart here with all of those mount combat powers, what kind of damage they're roughly giving you. You can see again the Cauldron there, and also your Swift Golden Lion at about 7% and 4%. And otherwise you can see the notes there with the Swift Golden Lion, its damage depending there, along with the Cauldron, your Rime Fire or your Frozen Retribution, and then your Balloons Bombardment, and those are the names of the combat powers. And we have additive and multiplicative. Keep in mind though, when I say multiplicative, I mean just when you cast the mount power, it acts like it's multiplicative. In fact, it's just a debuff, and it's going to stack with other debuffs. And the more debuffs you have, exactly like stats, the less effective they're going to be. So if we have 2 debuffs active at the same time, we get a 30% damage boost. And this doesn't necessarily translate. For example, here, let's say we are to go and set these damage buffs to be exactly the same. There we go, the difference is 0. And we are to add, let's say, 30% damage buff here are debuffs. You can see you only gain 23% overall damage, and we are to add, let's say, 90%. You can see it ends up at only 47%, and we get 100% extra debuffs, and that's only 50% extra damage. And this keeps decreasing. Like, let's say we have 300% debuffs, that's only 66, and it's going to tend to, yes, you're right, 99%. It will never get above double damage from all of your mounts. You can get artifacts to stack on top of that, and overall it is a pretty big boost, nearly getting double damage. But the maximum buffs you're going to probably get is about 300%, including artifacts, and that's overall a 66% damage boost, which is still very significant. So we have our chart here, and you can see I've ranked each of those combat powers. I believe the Swarm is pretty much the best for buffing your party's damage. It will also buff your party's survivability as well. Same with the Eclipse Lion. Then you have your King of Spines, Commander T-Rex, and your War Painted T-Rex. Keep in mind again, these do not stack with each other. You only want one T-Rex. Then there's the Pegasus. So if you're in a trial scenario, ideally somebody's running Swarm, Eclipse Lion, one of the T-Rexes and the Pegasus. Then you do have the Cauldron, which is about 7% buff, and you have your Swift Golden Lion down here. This 4% is questionable since it says it gives you 4%. It's just going to give you additional hits in terms of damage. It's unlikely going to add up to 4% of your overall damage, but it can probably proc your Band of Air a bit more often. And then you have your Salamander, and unfortunately the Reconnaissance Balloons, giving no damage buff because apparently it doesn't work at all. It doesn't change my damage output. Again, we can even check that right here. We grab our Maleficent Balloons Bombardment, we go and attack our dummy, we make sure we have our consistent damage output here. Oath Strike, we're getting that 3086, and then we go and cast these this treasury. There we go, we get our chest. We get all our treasure to spawn around us. Keep in mind, if we do pick up one of these treasures, we will randomly gain a boost to a certain stat. And that's that. We've cast it. We should get a 7.5% extra boost to our damage, but we can see no change. We are sorting to find the top damage we've dealt and no boost in our damage at all. These balloons don't work like they say they do. They should give 7.5% damage, and if they did, I would rank them a bit higher. I would rank them above the Swift Golden Lion and the Salamander, potentially in line with the Cauldron. But if people have accuracy capped, then I would even put it higher than the Cauldron, up below the Pegasus. Pegasus can be good to give you Forte stats as well. Most people won't gain any benefit from it because they'll just cap those stats regardless, and thus they're only gaining the 15% additive buff on top of their existing buffs, which can end up to be only about 7% damage, 8% damage. So with that said, hopefully this chart, this ranking here is good for you guys to prioritize which mounts you should upgrade. And in a trial scenario, again, you're having 2 healers, 2 tanks, and between them, one of them will have a Swarm, Eclipse Lion, a T-Rex, and a Pegasus. And that's what I found to be the best setup in a trial to obtain the most damage output. So again, hopefully this has been somewhat insightful and helps you guys as which mount powers or mounts you should be upgrading to have the particular damage buff powers. Again, generally only healers and tanks will be upgrading these. You can run a supportive buffing DPS character that can work pretty well, stacking all different sorts of things, and you can just buff your party's damage. That can be great too. Especially you can run a Pegasus. It does a decent amount of damage as well on a DPS, but still nowhere near as much as a Tunnel Vision or a Giant Toe Tongue Lash or a Golden Touch. And overall, I'd like to give a massive thank you to all of my channel members for helping me keep my channel going. And if I presented this well, consider leaving the video a like. If you're new around here, consider subscribing. We'll see you guys around. Goodbye for now.